A community receives Scripture as holy and wants to obey it. But Scripture doesn't answer every "how do we apply this today?" question in a step-by-step way. So teachers explain, the community repeats those explanations, and, slowly, the standard explanation can begin to feel as binding as the text itself. People still say, Scripture is highest, but day to day, the test becomes, do you follow the tradition? A Torah backdrop, blessing, boundaries, and the pull of inherited worship. In Deuteronomy, God speaks on the plains of Moab right before Israel crosses the Jordan into Canaan. This is a covenant handoff moment. The people are about to live in a land filled with existing worship sites, rituals, and religious habits that feel normal because everyone around them does them. God frames the choice in blunt terms, blessing or curse, life shaped by whether Israel obeys what God commanded or turns aside after other gods. Deuteronomy 11:26-32. Then he gets very practical. Israel must destroy the nation's worship places and objects and not reuse those patterns in the worship of the Lord. Deuteronomy 12:1-4. The most revealing line is the warning in Deuteronomy 12. How did these nations serve their gods? Even so, will I do likewise. 12:30. That's the temptation. Copy what works, then aim it toward God. But God's answer is direct. Thou shalt not do so unto the Lord thy God. 12:31. And Moses closes the section with a boundary that matters for this whole chapter. What things soever I command you, observe to do it. Thou shalt not add thereto, nor diminish from it. 12:32. So the Torah itself warns about two predictable moves: importing worship patterns because they feel familiar, and drifting from God's commands by adding and subtracting. That's the same mechanism we're tracing when tradition slowly becomes Scripture plus. Two Jewish examples of Scripture plus drift: 1. Mishnah. Rulings become the practical yardstick. After the exile, Torah is central again, but daily life questions multiply: Sabbath limits, purity details, meal practices. Teachers answer. The answers get repeated, collected, and stabilized. The drift shows up when the main question quietly changes. Not only what does the Torah say, but what do the accepted rulings require? At that point, tradition isn't just helping obedience. It is starting to define obedience. 2. Talmud. An interpretive system is born. Next, tradition becomes a whole framework. Definitions, case law patterns, precedents, and social enforcement. Scripture is still honored, but now it's often read through the system. Torah reading. The key question is authority. Is tradition serving Scripture, or controlling what Scripture is allowed to mean? When disagreeing with tradition is treated as disobeying God, tradition has taken Scripture-level weight in the conscience. Two Christian examples of the same drift. 1. Roman Catholic teaching. Scripture is not treated as sufficient by itself. If you want a direct Catholic source statement that Scripture is not a sufficient standalone guide, source for the Church's certainty in revealed, including saving truth, the Catechism says, does not derive her certainty about all revealed truths from the Holy Scriptures alone. CCC 82. Both Scripture and tradition must be accepted and honored. CCC 82. And the Council of Trent frames the gospel as the fountain of saving truth, then says that this truth is contained in the written books and the unwritten traditions. Trent, Session 1. You don't have to agree with that system to see why it matters here. It's an example of a community formally treating something alongside Scripture as binding authority. 2. Church disciplines hardened into sin-level obligations. This happens across many churches, even ones that claim to have no tradition. A practice starts as wisdom, but it can harden into, faithful Christians do this. If you question this, you're resisting God. When a rule becomes, you must do this to be faithful, even though Scripture never commands it, it becomes man-made law, functional authority. This is exactly what Jesus confronts. The argument is not Scripture versus no Scripture. Everyone honors the law. The conflict is, who gets to bind the conscience in daily life? In Mark 7 and Matthew 15, a tradition is being used to label people defiled. Jesus calls out the deeper issue. Traditions can bind where God has not bound, and can even be used to set aside God's command, the Corban example. So the warning signs are clear. Tradition can bind where God hasn't bound. Tradition can override what God commanded. Tradition can train people to fear breaking custom more than breaking Scripture. Relabeling, when the name changes, but the job stays the same. A relabeled practice is a custom that once carried religious meaning in a pre-Christian pagan setting, but later enters Christian life with new language attached to it. The label changes, but the function may not, so test it with one question. Does the practice sit alongside Christian life, or has it become a support beam for spiritual confidence? You can usually tell by what happens when it's questioned or removed. If people feel spiritually unsafe without it, it's not neutral. If it's treated as necessary to be right with God, it has functional authority. If rejecting it is treated as disobedience without a command in Scripture, it has crossed into man-made law. Hebrews keeps the issue grounded. Access to God rests on Christ's priesthood and the new and living way. He opened. If Christ provides full access, then any practice treated as necessary for that access competes with him. One-line summary. A relabeled custom becomes spiritually dangerous when it keeps doing the old religious work, providing assurance, cleansing, protection, or acceptance that Scripture assigns to Christ alone. The aim of this chapter isn't to insult any religious system. It's to name a human habit. We drift toward whatever feels solid and safe. In the first-century Jewish world, people had the written Torah. In the first-century Christian world, believers had the apostolic teaching, passed down from the apostles and preserved for the churches. Jesus taught from the Torah, and the apostles taught from that same foundation. They weren't adding later oral tradition as a parallel authority. They were teaching what Jesus taught, obedience to what God had already said. That's why Jesus clashed with the religious leaders of his time. And it's why Paul clashed with the religious leadership in his day as well. His conflict wasn't merely that he quoted Scripture, but that he put Scripture back in charge, exposing how Scripture plus had taken on the weight of law. So the takeaway isn't, tradition is always bad. The takeaway is a question you can apply anywhere. Am I learning to rely on what God has said, or on what my community has added?